The line between who we are and who we choose to become is often drawn in the most unexpected moments. For Richard Calloway, a man built on privilege, pride, and an unwavering belief in the world as he had always known it, that moment came in the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of St. Anne's Hospital. It came when his son couldn't breathe. It came when the only person who could save him was the very woman he had rejected the day before. Dr. Ayanna Carter, a woman whose skill, resilience, and dedication stood in stark contrast to the prejudice that had shaped Richard's life. What happens when a man who believes in superiority is forced to place his most precious treasure, the life of his child, into the hands of someone he refused to see as equal? Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? Which city are you in right now? This is a story of awakening, a story of pride, fear, and redemption. A story that proves that sometimes the most powerful lessons aren't taught by force, but by fate. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to your skin and made every breath feel heavier. Outside, the sun blazed mercilessly over the streets of Brookside, Georgia, casting long, shimmering waves of heat off the pavement. It was the kind of afternoon that made tempers short and patience even shorter. Inside St. Anne's Hospital, the cool hum of the air conditioning did little to ease the tension in the waiting room. The scent of antiseptic mixed with the faint aroma of coffee from the vending machine in the corner. Families sat in stiff chairs, some scrolling through their phones, others watching the clock as if willing time to move faster. Near the reception desk, Richard Calloway stood with his arms crossed, his face set in a mask of thinly veiled irritation. Tall and broad-shouldered, with graying blonde hair neatly combed back and piercing blue eyes, he had the kind of presence that demanded attention. His tailored navy suit and polished leather shoes seemed out of place in a hospital waiting room, but Richard was not a man accustomed to discomfort. His fingers tapped against his arm as he glanced at his Rolex. He had already been waiting 45 minutes. Unacceptable. He cleared his throat loudly, making sure the receptionist heard him. A nurse finally approached. "Mr. Calloway?" He straightened. "Yes, about time." The nurse offered a polite but tired smile. "Dr. Carter will see you now." Before Richard could respond, the exam room door opened, and in walked Dr. Ayanna Carter. She was a striking woman, mid to late 30s, with deep brown skin, high cheekbones, and dark eyes filled with quiet intelligence. Her long braids were neatly pulled back, and her crisp white coat bore her name, Dr. Ayanna Carter, MD. She extended her hand. "Mr. Calloway, I'm Dr. Carter. What brings you in today?" Richard's face hardened. His eyes flicked to her outstretched hand, then back up to her face. For a brief second there was silence, heavy, charged. Then in a voice cold and sharp as glass, he said, "I'd like another doctor." The words cut through the room. Dr. Carter's expression didn't change. She had seen this before. She had heard it before. But that didn't make it sting any less. The nurse beside her shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, Dr. Carter is one of our best physicians. I said, I want another doctor." Richard's tone was clipped, final. Ayanna let out a quiet breath, then lowered her hand. Her face remained calm, unreadable. "Understood," she said simply. No anger, no pleading, just professional, composed acceptance. Without another word, she stepped aside, signaling for the nurse to make the change. Richard didn't thank her. He didn't apologize. He just turned on his heel and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air like a stain that wouldn't wash out. The drive home was silent. Richard Calloway gripped the leather steering wheel of his black BMW, his knuckles white from the pressure. Outside, the late afternoon sun bathed Brookside in golden light, casting long shadows over the tree-lined streets and well-manicured lawns. It was the kind of neighborhood where people like him, wealthy, powerful, untouchable, built their lives. His house sat on the end of Windsor Drive, a sprawling two-story colonial with white columns and a circular driveway. The American dream, wrapped in brick and privilege. As the garage door rumbled shut behind him, Richard exhaled, rubbing his temples. His head throbbed, not from illness but from irritation. He couldn't shake the feeling of disgust from earlier, the look on that doctor's face, the way she had just stood there, unbothered, like she had every right to treat him. He scoffed. This world was changing too fast. Inside, the smell of roasted chicken filled the air. In the dining room, his wife, Charlotte, sat at the long oak table, sipping wine while their son, Ethan, pushed peas around his plate with a fork. Ethan was 10 years old, all blonde hair and green eyes, a perfect mirror of his father at that age. He was dressed in his private school uniform, crisp white shirt, navy tie loosened at the collar. He looked up when Richard entered. "You're late," Charlotte said, barely looking up from her glass. "Doctor's office took too damn long," Richard muttered, loosening his tie as he dropped into his seat. Ethan perked up. "Are you sick, Dad?" "Nothing serious." Richard reached for his water glass. "Didn't even see the doctor. Had to walk out." Charlotte arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Why?" Richard hesitated. He wasn't stupid. He knew better than to say it outright, especially in front of his son. Instead, he chose his words carefully. "Let's just say I didn't trust the person assigned to me." Charlotte seemed to understand immediately. She gave a small, knowing nod and took another sip of wine. Ethan, however, furrowed his brows. "But aren't all doctors supposed to help people?" Richard smirked. "Kids, so naive." "Sure, but that doesn't mean I have to let just anyone treat me." Ethan thought about that for a moment, then asked, "Was it because she was a woman?" Charlotte let out a soft chuckle. Richard shook his head, suppressing a sigh. "No, son. It's just sometimes people aren't as good at their jobs as others. It's about choosing the best." Ethan nodded slowly, but something in his expression shifted. He looked confused, maybe even uncomfortable. But he didn't press the issue. Instead, he poked at his food again, his appetite suddenly gone. The night had been restless. Ethan had woken up 3 times, his small voice calling out from his bedroom down the hall. At first, Richard thought it was just a bad dream. But by the second time, he knew something was wrong. Now, as the morning sun barely peeked through the heavy curtains of his room, panic gripped his chest like a vice. Ethan lay in bed, his face flushed, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. His once bright green eyes were now glassy, unfocused. His small hands clutched at the bedsheets as if trying to hold on to something. Richard's heart pounded. This wasn't just a fever. This was something else. Something worse. "Charlotte!" His voice thundered through the house as he lifted Ethan into his arms. Charlotte rushed in, still tying her robe. The second she saw Ethan, her face paled. "Oh my God. We need to go. Now." Richard didn't wait for a response. He was already moving, already heading toward the door. The drive to St. Anne's Hospital was a blur. Richard barely registered the speeding cars, the red lights he ran, the blaring horns. All he could hear was Ethan's breathing, shallow, uneven, frighteningly weak. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, watching his son's small body slumped in the back seat. "Stay with me, buddy," he murmured. "Just hang in there." By the time they screeched into the emergency entrance, nurses were already rushing out with a stretcher. "He's burning up!" Charlotte cried as Richard carried Ethan out of the car. A nurse reached for Ethan, but Richard refused to let go. His arms tightened around his son as if giving him up meant losing him forever. "Sir, we need to take him now," one of the nurses said, her voice urgent but calm. Richard finally relented, laying Ethan down carefully on the stretcher. "Help him," he choked out. "Please." The nurses rushed him inside, and Richard and Charlotte followed. And then, she stepped into view. Dr. Ayanna Carter. She was already slipping on her gloves, her expression focused, her voice sharp with authority. "What are his symptoms?" she asked, barely sparing Richard a glance. The color drained from his face. No, not her, not the doctor he had refused, not the woman he had disrespected. But as he opened his mouth, ready to demand someone else, Ethan let out a weak, wheezing gasp. Richard froze. His pride, his prejudice, none of it mattered anymore. He looked at Ayanna, his jaw tightening. Then, barely above a whisper, he said the only words that mattered. "Save him." The emergency room was a blur of movement. Nurses barking orders, machines beeping, the wheels of Ethan's stretcher squeaking against the polished tile floor. But Richard only saw one thing. Dr. Ayanna Carter. She moved with calm precision, her hands steady, her voice sharp and confident. The same woman he had dismissed without a second thought less than 24 hours ago. And now she was the only thing standing between his son and something unthinkable. Richard's chest tightened, his pulse pounding in his ears. Not her, not her, anyone but her. He took a step forward, his voice hoarse but firm. "Is there another doctor available?" A silence, thick and heavy, settled over the room. A nurse paused mid-step. A young intern glanced between them, wide-eyed. Ayanna didn't stop. She barely even looked at him. "Ethan's airway is compromised," she said, her tone unwavering. "His oxygen levels are dropping. If we don't intubate now, he won't make it." Richard felt his stomach drop. Ethan let out a weak, strangled gasp, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic movements. His small fingers twitched, reaching blindly, for him, for anyone, for help. And in that moment, Richard didn't see a doctor he didn't trust. He saw the only person in that room who knew how to save his son. His pride, his anger, his beliefs, none of it mattered anymore. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He could barely recognize his own voice when he spoke. "Save him." Ayanna nodded once, already moving. "Nurse, prep for intubation. We need to stabilize him before we lose the airway completely." Richard stood frozen as she worked, watching the hands he had refused to shake the day before now fight to save the most precious thing in his life. Charlotte clutched his arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "He's going to be okay, right?" Her voice cracked on the last word. He didn't answer. He couldn't, because for the first time in his life, Richard Calloway had no control. The ER was a storm of urgency. The sharp scent of antiseptic clung to the air, monitors beeped in rapid succession, and the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed softly, a cruel contrast to the chaos unfolding below. Ethan lay motionless on the hospital bed, his skin slick with sweat, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, frighteningly slow movements. Dr. Ayanna Carter moved swiftly, her hands sure, her focus absolute. "Pulse is weak," a nurse reported. "Oxygen saturation dropping 84%. "Bag him," Ayanna ordered, snapping on a fresh pair of gloves. "We're not waiting any longer." A young intern fumbled with an oxygen mask, but Ayanna was already reaching for the laryngoscope. Her voice remained calm, but her movements were urgent. Every second counted. Richard couldn't breathe, his hands balled into fists at his sides as he watched. Powerless, useless. He was a man who built his life on control. A man who commanded rooms, closed deals, dictated outcomes. But right now, his son's life was hanging on the hands of a woman he had refused. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. His legs felt like lead, rooted to the cold hospital floor. Ayanna leaned over Ethan, her voice firm yet steady. "Ethan, honey, I need you to stay with me, okay? You're doing so well. Just a little longer." No response. Her jaw tightened. "Starting intubation," she announced, adjusting the scope. "Hold him steady." Richard's pulse pounded in his ears. His mind screamed at him to do something, but there was nothing he could do. And then, Ethan's body gave a sudden, violent jerk. Alarms shrieked. Charlotte let out a sharp cry. "What's happening? What's happening?" "He's crashing," a nurse called out, adjusting the IV drip. "Airway is almost fully blocked," Ayanna said, but there was no panic in her voice, only determination. Richard wanted to pray, wanted to bargain with any higher power that would listen. But the words wouldn't come. Because what right did he have to pray for help, when he had looked this very woman in the eye yesterday and refused her? Ayanna didn't hesitate. With expert precision, she guided the tube past Ethan's swollen airway, her hands steady despite the urgency pressing in around her. For a moment, an eternity, there was only silence. Then, a beep. Then another. Then another. Ethan's chest rose. Richard's breath hitched. Ayanna exhaled, pressing her stethoscope against Ethan's small frame. After a moment, she nodded. "We got him." A collective breath of relief swept through the room. Richard's knees nearly buckled. He had almost lost his son, and the person he had tried to cast aside had just saved him. The hospital room was dim, illuminated only by the soft blue glow of the heart monitor beside Ethan's bed. The steady beeping was the only sound breaking the silence. Richard sat in the chair next to his son, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. He hadn't moved in hours. Ethan was stable, alive. The ventilator still hummed beside him, pushing air into his small lungs, but his color had returned, and his body no longer trembled from exhaustion. He looked peaceful now, as if sleeping through a normal night at home. But Richard couldn't shake the image of him fighting for air, his little fingers twitching, his lips turning pale. He had nearly lost him, and it was Dr. Carter who had saved him. Richard leaned back, exhaling slowly. His mind drifted, backward, to a different time, a different voice. "Never trust them, son." His father's words echoed in his mind, as clear as if the old man were standing right next to him. The world has a natural order. You don't question it, you don't change it, you stick with your own and you'll be just fine. Richard had been raised in a home where power meant exclusion, where legacy mattered more than kindness, where people like Ayanna Carter were seen as lesser, not because of what they did, but simply because of who they were. He never questioned it, never even thought to. It was just the way things were, until today. Until he had sat in this very chair, watching that woman work, seeing the fierce, unshakable determination in her eyes as she fought to save his son. Until he had seen true strength, not in a boardroom, not in a courtroom, not in the privileges he had been handed, but in her hands, her skill, her refusal to let his son die, despite the way he had treated her. His stomach twisted. What would his father say if he knew? No. He knew exactly what the old man would say. He would be disgusted. Richard swallowed, staring at Ethan's small, sleeping face. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he cared. The hours crawled by. The quiet hum of the machines was the only thing filling the space between Richard and the truth he wasn't ready to face. He had almost let his son suffer because of his own pride. He sat by Ethan's bedside, his fingers pressed against his temples, his mind replaying the moment over and over. The second Ayanna had stepped into that ER room, his instinct had been to reject her. He had still been clinging to that poisonous certainty that she wasn't good enough, that he couldn't trust her, that someone else, someone better, should take her place. And yet, she had been the one to save Ethan's life. His stomach twisted, shame curling in his chest like something heavy and unshakable. The door opened softly. Richard looked up just as Dr. Carter stepped inside. She still wore her white coat, her badge clipped neatly to her pocket, but the exhaustion in her eyes betrayed the long hours she had just worked. She didn't speak at first. She simply studied the monitors, checking Ethan's vitals. Her fingers moved over the machines with practiced ease, adjusting his IV, making sure the numbers were stable. Richard cleared his throat. "How is he?" She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Stable." A pause. "If we had waited any longer," she exhaled, shaking her head. "It could have been different." Richard's chest tightened. He knew what she was saying. If he had fought harder, refused her again, his son might not be here right now. His fingers curled into his palm. Ayanna took a step back, pressing the tablet against her hip. "He'll need to stay for observation, but his vitals are improving." Richard nodded stiffly. His throat felt dry. She turned to leave. "Dr. Carter." She stopped. For a second, he didn't know what to say. He had spent his whole life avoiding these moments, the moments where he had to face the weight of his own choices. His pride screamed at him to keep quiet, to let it go, pretend like none of this had happened, like he hadn't made a terrible mistake. But then he looked at his son, sleeping, alive. His voice came out hoarse. "Thank you." Ayanna studied him, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something knowing. She nodded once. Then, without another word, she walked out, and Richard was left sitting there, staring at the door, realizing that for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to say. The soft glow of the hospital room's nightlight cast gentle shadows across the walls. The steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence, a rhythmic reminder that Ethan was still here, still breathing, still alive. Richard sat at his son's bedside, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. Ethan had been sleeping peacefully for hours now, his chest rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm. His color had returned, the flush of fever replaced by the softness of childhood. But Richard? He felt like a man who had been cracked open, his insides hollowed out by the weight of everything he had refused to see before today. The door creaked open. He looked up. Dr. Carter. She stepped inside quietly, a clipboard in hand, her eyes flicking between the monitors, the IV, the numbers on the screen. Professional, composed, the way she had been since the moment she walked into Ethan's ER room. Richard watched her, his throat tightening. She had saved his son, and he had treated her like she was nothing. "His oxygen levels are steady," she said after a moment, checking the readings. "He's responding well to the medication. He should be able to breathe on his own by tomorrow morning." Richard swallowed. "That's good." She nodded, jotting something down in her notes. There was an unbearable weight in the room, a tension that sat between them like an unspoken truth neither of them wanted to touch. Richard cleared his throat, his fingers tightening around the fabric of his pants. "Dr. Carter, He stopped. She turned to face him, arms crossed loosely over her coat, waiting. His jaw clenched. Apologies were foreign to him. He wasn't the kind of man who admitted weakness, who admitted fault. But tonight, that kind of man felt like a stranger to him. He looked at Ethan, his small fingers curled around the blanket, his breath slow and steady. Then he looked back at her, and for the first time in his life, he truly saw her. Not just as a doctor, not just as the woman he had dismissed, but as the person who had given his son a future. His throat burned. He exhaled slowly. But Ayanna held up a hand. "You don't have to," she said simply. Richard stared at her. There was no resentment in her voice. No anger, just truth. A truth that made his stomach twist. Because even if she didn't need to hear it, he knew he needed to say it. But she had already turned back to the monitors, already moved past whatever had happened between them. And for the first time, Richard realized just how small he had been. The morning sun streamed through the blinds, casting soft golden lines across the sterile white walls of the hospital room. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors was slower now, steady, reassuring. Ethan stirred. Richard sat up instantly, his chair creaking as he leaned forward. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice rough from the long night. Ethan blinked, his green eyes still groggy with sleep. His small fingers twitched as he reached for the breathing tube. Richard caught his hand gently. "No, leave it, son. You need it a little longer." Ethan's brows knitted together. His voice was raspy when he whispered, "Did I get sick?" Richard swallowed hard, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, you did, but you're okay now." Ethan blinked again, trying to remember. His gaze flickered across the room, landing on the IV, the monitors, and then the door opened, and Dr. Ayanna Carter walked in. She was dressed in her usual white coat, her expression calm but attentive as she checked the monitors, scanning over the numbers on the screen. Ethan watched her carefully, his small fingers fidgeting with the blanket. Then, his voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Did you save me?" Ayanna glanced at Richard. Richard held his breath. She turned back to Ethan, offering a small smile. "I had some help," she said gently. "But yes, we made sure you're going to be just fine." Ethan's little chest rose in a deep inhale. He studied her as if seeing her for the first time. Then, after a long pause, he smiled, a soft, grateful, genuine smile. "Thank you, Dr. Carter," he said simply. Richard's throat tightened. Ethan didn't see color. He didn't see status or power or division. He only saw the woman who had saved his life. And then, without hesitation, Ethan added, "I want to be a doctor like you someday." Richard's breath caught. Ayanna's eyes flickered with something unreadable, something between surprise and quiet understanding. She smiled again, softer this time. "I think you'd be a great doctor, Ethan." Ethan beamed, and Richard, for the first time in his life, wondered what kind of world he'd been preparing his son for. Because if there was one thing he knew now, it was this. His son deserved to grow up seeing the world differently than he had. The discharge papers were signed. Ethan was officially going home. Charlotte was gathering their things, tucking Ethan's favorite blanket around his small shoulders while he sat in a wheelchair, his eyes still a little tired but bright with excitement. He was ready to leave, ready to return to normal. But Richard? Richard wasn't sure what normal even meant anymore. He stood near the hospital bed, watching as a nurse adjusted Ethan's IV one last time. His mind felt like a storm, memories, mistakes, regrets colliding all at once. And then, as if fate wasn't finished with him yet, Dr. Ayanna Carter stepped into the room. She was holding a clipboard, her expression professional but calm, the same way she had been since the moment he met her. Only now, he wasn't the same man who had refused to shake her hand. She glanced at Ethan first. "How are you feeling, buddy?" Ethan grinned. "Good, and I don't need the breathing thing anymore." He gestured to his throat dramatically. "I can talk again," Ayanna chuckled. "That's great to hear." Then, slowly, she turned to Richard. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Richard swallowed hard. The words felt heavy, sticking to the back of his throat, but he forced himself to say them. "I was wrong." Ayanna's face remained unreadable. She said nothing, waiting. Richard exhaled, running a hand down his face. About everything. The air between them felt thick, filled with things he should have said yesterday, years ago, maybe even his entire life. "I was raised to believe." He hesitated, glancing at Ethan. His son was watching, curious, soaking in every word, the way children always do. Richard clenched his jaw, forcing himself to continue. I was raised to believe a lot of things, he admitted. Things that made me blind to people like you. His voice lowered. People who don't deserve that. Ayanna studied him, her brown eyes sharp. Richard wasn't sure what he expected. Anger, dismissal, maybe even satisfaction. But instead, she simply nodded and said, "Make sure your son grows up knowing that." The words hit him harder than he expected. Because she was right. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about Ethan, about the kind of world his son would live in, the kind of man he would become. And Richard, for the first time in his life, wanted to be the kind of father who helped him see it clearly. Ethan's voice broke the silence. "Dad?" Richard looked down. Ethan smiled. "Can we go now?" Richard let out a small chuckle, ruffling his son's blonde hair. "Yeah, buddy, we can go." As they rolled Ethan's wheelchair toward the door, Richard stopped beside Ayanna, his voice quieter now. "Thank you, Dr. Carter." This time, he meant it. And that's the story of a man who thought he had everything figured out until life proved him wrong in the most unexpected way. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from the people we least expect. And sometimes change isn't about what we say, it's about what we choose to do moving forward. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about this story? What lesson did it teach you? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to tell me where you're watching from. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.